Hello, and welcome to the Packard Foundation and EDGE Research webinar on millennials and ocean plastics. Today, we're going to be looking at some new research on plastics as the gateway to engaging the next generation of ocean conservationists.
Hi, I'm Lisa Dropkin, and with me are...
Hi, Stacia Tipton.
And I'm Aaron Bernicking.
This project is a continuation
of work begun in 2015 to examine the millennial population and understand how we can capture this large and diverse group to be a voice for the ocean, the next generation of ocean conservationists. To see all of the Packard resources related to millennials and ocean conservation, visit www.packard.org and click on what we are learning. If you're interested in getting more information about this project, you can contact any of the EDGE team at dropkin@edgeresearch.com, tipton@edgeresearch.com, or bernicking@edgeresearch.com. The project was designed with two interests in mind. Although the Packard Foundation does not currently have a specific funding commitment to ocean plastics, a number of Packard grantees, as well as other conservation organizations, are pursuing ocean plastics programs and campaigns. We were seeking to help the community answer questions they have about how to engage millennials on ocean plastics. And we wanted to answer the Packard question: is plastics an area for consideration because it will advance other conservation objectives? To that end, we sought to answer three key questions. What are the most effective ways to talk about plastics with millennials? Does concern about plastics in the ocean lead to interest or willingness to engage on other ocean conservation challenges? And if that's the case, what's the pivot? Which issues will bridge or transition from plastic into even deeper ocean engagement? Our approach to understanding millennial attitudes on plastics and the pivot to broader ocean conservation included wanting to compare them to people who are actively supporting ocean protection today. How different are millennials from those who are already engaged with the community's work? To that end, two Packard grantees, Ocean Conservancy and Surfrider, kindly provided access to survey their membership and activist databases. These survey respondents comprise an engaged control group against which we compare millennial responses in the survey analysis. In addition, these two grantees, plus a third, the Monterey Bay Aquarium, shared descriptions and ideas of their different plastics programs so we could understand how millennials will respond to solutions. A quick note: throughout this presentation, we remind you of which responses belong to which audiences with these symbols and colors, millennials in purple and the engaged in blue. Now we're going to take you through some of the key findings from this research, and after that, we're going to dig into the details behind these findings. First and foremost, for millennials, plastic in the ocean has traction as a top pollution concern. There is belief that we can make progress on this problem, and they find compelling solutions in personal actions and the work of conservation groups. Plastics, and specifically plastics in the ocean, generate concern much more so than plastic pollution generally. Impacts to animals are the key lever to pull. And lifestyle solutions are tops for this group, but there is evidence of plenty of support for the work of conservation groups as well. Exposure to the ocean plastics issue does appear to generate greater willingness to support conservation broadly. Marine mammal protection, water quality, and habitat are the next step issues. Unfortunately, fisheries is not the beneficiary, at least not at this time. As a gateway to ocean conservation, plastics generates interest in what conservation groups are doing, support for big picture solutions, and willingness to give money and a desire to learn more. Next, we're going to hear more about the details behind these findings.
To give some context, millennials like myself have a number of different concerns. For most, environmental concerns are among the top 5, but often fall behind social and/or economic issues. That said, a very low percentage report that the environment is not a concern. Among respondents that have already engaged with ocean conservation groups, 2/3 consider it a top issue. Given the current political and cultural climate, it's no surprise that social justice gets the most attention. When looking at segments defined by earlier research, there are clear differences in how global greens, coastal concern, and waiting in the wings segments prioritize these issues. The global greens, being most like traditional environmentalists, rank environmental issues equal to the economy and higher than other segments rank any issue. Their increased awareness and concern on various issues supports findings from other research. Finally, the least concerned millennials were those that fell outside of our target segments. As we break down some of the different environmental concerns, it's clear that clean waterways and clean air are millennials' top priorities. Despite traction found later in the data around plastics issues, the term plastic pollution with no further context does not register strongly with this group. On the other side, the engaged respondents give almost all issues an equally high priority. The ocean community may consider setting priorities around issues that need the most attention. Their followers are fired up on all topics, but as we'll see later, this has not always been the case.
In the next section, we'll circle around the plastics issue and share what we learned about communications that resonate. Here you see that survey results reinforce the earlier learning, takeaways Edge and Packard had from the online communities, where we saw that millennials were activated by visuals and images that were more provocative, more visceral than what we tend to see from our ocean conservation community. Over to the left, you see the picture that is a before and after underwater image of what fossil fuels are doing to the ocean. And the picture that we've labeled the sea of garbage, where the people in the picture are so small compared to all the trash floating around those. Those grabbed the most attention from millennials in the survey. Each had about 30% of respondents say they were the images most likely to grab their attention, and a little more than that said that they would click on these two images to learn more. On the question of ocean problems, we can all sigh a little bit in relief here. Strong majorities of millennials see all these as problems. So the question for the EDGE team was, which problems had the most urgency? In the graph in purple, you're seeing the percentage of millennials who would say that these problems are problems of today. And all forms of pollution top the list and hit a nerve here. 7 in 10 millennials would say problems today are oil spills, litter and trash ending up in the ocean, pollution from sewage runoff that comes from land, and increasing amounts of plastic ending up in the ocean. Other issues might be a problem for the future or not so much.
We look at this data in the EDGE office and it raises the question, could plastics be the next oil spill issue? It's obvious, it's visual, it's very scary to millennials. I want to pause on the data here and turn it over to Lisa for a moment. Lisa, you've been studying these issues for years. What do you think?
Thanks, Stacia. So just to put this in context, oil spills has topped the list of ocean threats since we have been tracking beginning in 1998. I don't think we've ever had data that didn't show it as the #1 threat to the ocean. But as we all know, oil spills are really sporadic and they galvanize attention only in a crisis. It was really exciting to us to see that plastic rose to the top. It was really at parity with oil spills as a threat to the ocean, and it's a constant and pervasive threat, so it provides a real opportunity for us.
Thanks for the perspective. Well, before we were looking at general ocean images, we had another section of the survey that tested images specific to plastic. And the finding is that millennials and engaged audiences can't seem to ignore when animals are harmed by plastic. Over on the left, You see 3 different images here showing the damage done to animals, whether that's the turtle tangled up in the plastic rings or plastic trash in the guts of a bird, or a turtle's view and all those plastic bags floating around in their habitat. More millennials said that these images were likely to get their attention and that they would click on them to learn more than the other images we offered. I think Aaron even saw one of these in social media recently.
That's true. Just a couple weeks ago, I saw a post using that same image of the bird. From what I could tell, it had a lot of engagement. If you're one of the organizations using this image or similar messaging, reach out to us. We'd love to hear how it's going.
Here you see additional numbers that back up the finding, millennials being engaged on the issues of marine life. This question was asked of those who indicated in the survey that plastic trash was a problem. So the follow-up question was, what concerns you most about plastic trash in the ocean? And they could pick 2 concerns from the list. You see right at the top, 40+% of millennials were most concerned that marine animals get tangled up and injured by plastic garbage, and that marine animals eat plastic, mistaking it for food. It's interesting that these were also the most urgent concerns with our engaged community. Here's a finding that generated a lot of conversation in our office. The question was, how likely do you think we are to make progress on reducing the amount of plastic trash going into the ocean in the next 5 years? On the left in purple, you see right away these millennials are optimistic. They think these problems are solvable. 64% would say we're likely to make progress. 25% of millennial respondents would say we're very likely to make progress in these next few years. Contrast that with the bars in blue in our engaged community, where 44% think we're likely and only 10% very likely to make any progress. So we had to take a pause here and think about whether this was going to be good or bad news for the ocean conservation community.
And our assessment over at EDGE is that this level of optimism can be very advantageous, since feeling deflated, like there's no hope, could interfere with the results-focused strategy identified in earlier studies.
Now we'll get into data that has tactical implications for communication, starting with facts we can use to tell our ocean plastic story. You see that there are some facts and statements that rise to the top in being the most motivating to millennials, well ahead of the other statements. This statement that by 2050, researchers estimate there could be more plastic in the ocean than fish, and if we don't start now, the problem will be unfixable. We know there's some question about whether we can prove that. If it's true, it appears to be highly motivating. 58% of our millennials would say this is highly motivating as a fact about the issue. With our engaged community, it was also more motivating the other statements and well ahead of the other facts. That top tier of highly motivating statements also includes that 8 million metric tons of plastic get washed into the ocean each year, that plastic is toxic trash. It travels around the ocean, enters the food chain when it's eaten by fish, and that worldwide people use roughly 200 billion plastic water bottles each year. There's a lot more we could say about this data, and we appreciate all of the groups that submitted ideas and statements for testing. But we'll just call out 2 points here for the webinar. One is that you see a difference when we talk about the plastic trash entering the food chain because it's eaten by fish. 46% of millennials told us that was highly motivating. And when we have a broader statement, a little farther below, that fish ingest small plastic particles from the ocean water and we don't know what the impact is on people. It would seem that it's more troubling to millennials that animals are eating this stuff than whatever implication it might have for us as humans right now. I'll also mention that you see it was a split sample on the statement about 200 billion plastic water bottles used worldwide. We split the sample here to compare that against another statement that focused on American use of plastic bags. Interestingly, we saw less traction for the fact on Americans and plastic bag use. 38% of millennials told us that was highly motivating. With our engaged community, it was also the case that worldwide water bottle use was more motivating to them than Americans in their use of plastic bags. Go figure. So true for millennials and for the engaged. In this next question, we did have differences that jumped out in the findings for millennials and for the engaged. At this point in the survey, respondents were presented with these ideas or these themes about what's causing the problem of plastic trash in the ocean. And they had to actively sort them on the screen, order them from 1 to 5 in what they thought would be the ways to solve the plastic pollution problem. Over on the left in the table in purple, you see that 48% of millennial respondents would put the emphasis on individual behavior. In their 1 or 2 spot was that too many people in the US and around the world don't dispose of trash properly or recycle. In the table in blue on the right, you see that almost the exact same number of the engaged community would put the emphasis on consumptive lifestyle. In their 1 or 2 spot was the idea that developed countries have a high consumption lifestyle and value convenience, which leads to a lot of single-use throwaway packaging. So a bit of a different take coming from each audience, which we think probably has implications for communication and how we're going to meet audiences where they are today. Taking all that into account, where can we go from here? On this chart, millennials are telling us that large numbers are carrying reusable beverage containers, carrying their reusable bags, and recycling packaging when they can. So what we're identifying as the next wave of call to action are these actions you can take that have a foothold of millennials and that good numbers are also willing to do. Specifically, reducing everyday plastics, such as sandwich bags and juice cartons, and replacing them with reusables. And when buying plastic, choosing those that are the most commonly recycled plastic. In the full report, anybody interested can see that from the data, it suggests with our members and the engaged community, you can ask them to go even further, that in addition to replacing everyday plastics and choosing recycled plastic materials, they're willing to refuse single-serving packaging and avoid single-serving packaged foods. To wrap up this section, one more slide of data for you in terms of what millennials can do with you as ocean conservation groups. Well, the easiest ask is to ask them to volunteer. Probably not a surprise to this community. 45% of millennials say that that's something they'd be willing to do. And more than a third are willing to reduce the use of single-use plastic in their lives and support plastic bottle deposits when we explain it as 5 cents more for a plastic bottle that you get back when you return it. There are other things that millennials are willing to do. And at the bottom of the page, we find it encouraging here that 25% say they're willing to donate to a nonprofit organization. That's 1 in 4 millennials that are willing to take that traditional action of donating and becoming a member of one of your groups. The story doesn't end there. Lisa, talk to us about strategy. What's the opportunity with this ocean plastics issue, if there's an opportunity for the future?
Thanks, Stacia. To get at the question of whether plastics really represents a gateway opportunity on ocean conservation, we embedded 3 behavioral tests into our survey. We really wanted to push on whether plastics is persuadable and would really generate commitment. The first test was a test of which issues millennials would like to become engaged on. Our respondents were divided into 2 random groups, and one group was asked which ocean issues they would want to be involved in before getting any of the information about plastics. The other group was asked after getting the plastics information. Our second behavior test was a click-through test to get some more information about some different ocean conservation problems. So millennial respondents were offered information about 4 additional topics, and we measured the percent that would click through to learn more. Finally, we wanted to see if we could get millennials to put their money where their mouth is. Our millennial respondents were each given $5 at the start of the survey. They could keep it, or they could choose to give it away. They were sorted into 3 random groups. One group got asked to keep or give the money at the very beginning of the survey, before they heard anything. One group was asked after the plastics information that the different Packard grantees shared with us about their programmatic solutions. Would they give the $5 to support any of those programs? And the final group was asked after hearing the messages about the other 4 ocean conservation issues. So let's take a look at how our behavior test came out. What you're seeing on the screen now is the appetite for ocean engagement among that first group that was asked early on in the survey before receiving any information about plastic pollution, about which issues they had a lot of interest in getting involved in. And what we can see right off the bat is that 46% of our millennials are already interested in stopping plastic trash in the ocean. And that's one of the top items. The next item at 47%, truly, I guess, the top item, is protecting marine animals. So very consistent with the other data that we've seen on what millennials care about when it comes to our ocean. The really interesting stuff comes when we look at the group that was asked after receiving the plastics information. With this graphic, what you're seeing is a comparison between the group that was asked before plastics information in the dark purple and the group that was asked after receiving plastics information in the light purple. And what we can see here is that the percentage who express a lot of interest in getting involved on any of these topics is larger among the group who's been exposed to the plastics information. We still see stopping plastic and protecting marine animals as some of the most engaging things that millennials want to become involved in, but we also see some really interesting shifts. So protecting habitats, which actually didn't score that well among our millennial group who hadn't heard about plastics, gets a 7-point bump, and 45% of the millennials who heard about the plastics issue say they'd like to become involved in protecting habitats. We see a similar bump around restoring coastal habitat. So this is some of our first evidence that exposure to plastics, engaging and thinking about that ocean threat, does increase receptivity to other ocean threats. Our next test had to do with click-through behavior and the desire to learn more about other issues. We're calling these pivot topics. So basically, respondents were offered little teasers about 4 different ocean conservation problems after they were exposed to the plastics information in the survey. Our pivot topics were threats to marine animals, overfishing, coastal degradation and what's needed to improve protection of our coasts, and living an ocean-friendly lifestyle. So encouragingly, 4 in 10 of our millennial survey respondents did click to learn more after they read the pivot messages. And all of the topics generated about the same amount of interest. Now, our engaged audiences were a little bit different. They showed more interest overall on every topic and differentiated a little bit more. So while about 45% of millennials would click through to learn more about any given topic, the topics that really captivated those who are already ocean engaged were overfishing and marine mammal protection. Exciting, though, is the fact that 23% of the millennials surveyed clicked to learn more on all of these topics, showing us that about a quarter of millennials can really form the core of the next generation of ocean conservationists. And to compare, we asked our engaged audiences about their own path to becoming ocean conservationists. At the beginning of the survey, we asked what aspect of ocean conservation they were first interested in. And what we see is that more than a third of them got engaged in ocean conservation because they were interested in protecting marine animals. Another roughly 3 in 10 said damage to ocean habitats is what brought them in the door. And their most likely behavior to show their support for ocean conservation was to make a donation to a group. 41% said that was their first act. What's really interesting for us here is that millennials show such a high engagement on plastics. If we look at our engaged audiences, only 27% said that plastic trash was the thing that really got their attention or got them engaged on ocean conservation. But we're seeing much higher numbers from our millennials on this issue. Finally, as we mentioned, 3 Packard grantees shared descriptions of their organization's efforts on ocean plastics. To ensure that the descriptions were distinct, we focused on the unique aspects of each program rather than describing everything each organization is doing. To that end, the Surfrider work was described as focusing on beaches and coastal waters, highlighting their local, community-based approaches to conservation through cleanups, bag bans, and ocean-friendly restaurant programs to support the move to plastic-free meals. Ocean Conservancy's work was described in the context of their work in Asia to identify the primary sources of ocean plastic entering the ocean and multi-stakeholder efforts to address waste management infrastructure in Asian countries such as Indonesia, the Philippines, and Vietnam. The Monterey Bay Aquarium work was described as taking their sustainable seafood model and applying it to the problem of ocean plastics, working with aquariums around the country to reduce single-use plastic in their own operations, educate their visitors, and describing the solution as a combination of individual consumer behavior, individual business adoption, and scaling up to reduction in plastic and an increase in the use of environmentally friendly materials. What's exciting is the engagement all of these approaches generate. So we see, in terms of overall interest in what any of the groups are doing, 3/4 of millennials are interested in the approaches of Surfrider, Ocean Conservancy, and the Monterey Bay Aquarium. And that interest extends to interest in supporting their plastics work at 73%. For Surfrider, 72 for Ocean Conservancy, 75 for Monterey Bay Aquarium, basically, again, 3/4. Also exciting is that millennials feel that these approaches are likely to make progress. And finally, if we think back to what we're trying to accomplish with our behavior test here, we saw with Stacia, when she was showing us the information on what millennials would do to help on this issue, that about 25% said they would donate money to a conservation group. Well, here, with the specifics behind what Surfrider, Ocean Conservancy, and the Monterey Bay Aquarium are doing, we see that 4 in 10 of our millennial respondents gave their $5 to support one of these 3 campaigns. So at the end of the day, when it came to the behavioral test of putting your money where your mouth is, what we learned about our millennials is that those that were asked at the very beginning of the survey if they wanted to keep their $5 or donate it to charity, about 15% chose to donate it to charity. Not bad, but most people kept the $5. What's very encouraging for us is that after the plastics exposure, when asked about one of the 3 campaigns, 40% of those millennials gave their $5 to the campaigns. And for the other group that was asked what to do with their $5 after they read about the 4 pivot messages, again, we see 39%, basically the same number, who choose to give that $5 to ocean causes. And the way that sort of broke out for them is about 14% chose to contribute the money to ending plastic pollution. We saw another 11% give to a marine life protection fund, and the remainder sort of split out on different issues around overfishing and habitat protection. So just to wrap up and to offer some implications about ocean plastics as a gateway to conservation, we want to go back to those key questions we were trying to answer. What are the most effective ways to talk about plastics with millennials? Well, if we're boiling it down to a nutshell, it's sheer volume and its impact on marine animals. So unlike some of the other conservation issues where we have to tie back and connect a bunch of dots to human health, this doesn't seem to be one where we have to work so hard to come up with a relevant impact. Millennials are concerned on its face, and they're concerned about impacts to marine animals. Second question, does concern about ocean plastics lead to interest or willingness to engage on other ocean conservation challenges? Well, let's just take a step back for a minute here. Most importantly, it leads to engagement on this issue, the issue of ocean plastics. It's a big opportunity to connect on something that people care about. And they show us that their willingness to give money, particularly to ocean conservation efforts, is a way to open the door to more communications from the community. And taking personal actions, which they're also willing to do, becomes something to talk about, a way to advance the issue among their peer group. If we're thinking about plastics as the gateway, what's the pivot? Which issues are going to build the bridge? Well, this data suggests that it's really about marine mammals and habitat protection. And we're going to have a little ways to go before we can connect the dots to some of that more complex fisheries work. That brings us to the end of our webinar. We want to thank you so much for listening to us. And again, if you have any questions or want any information, please feel free to contact the EDGE team.